The Rana Plaza collapse. Basically, Rana Plaza wasn't exactly a symbol of engineering brilliance. The building was constructed by Sohail Rana and his father, who weren't exactly known for their architectural expertise, unless you count cutting corners as a talent. The building was initially designed for commercial use, but Sohail decided to convert it into a garment factory. Well, there were several problems with this plan. For one, Sohail went rogue and added 5 extra floors to the building without proper permits or safety checks, as if he were playing Jenga with lives. Oh, and those extra floors weren't just empty space, they were packed with heavy sewing machines crammed with about 5,000 workers and held up under a ticking time bomb of poor construction. Now, on April 23, 2013, engineers came by to check on the building and found big suspicious cracks in the wall. If you were in any part of the world, this would have been an immediate red flag, and people would have been told to get out faster than you can say unsafe. But here, the engineers knew something was wrong and could only warn Sohail and the workers to evacuate. But the next day, April 24th, Sohail Rana decided to pull a move straight out of the bad boss playbook, and despite knowing about the cracks, he ordered all of his workers to come in as usual. Sadly, disaster struck, and the building couldn't handle the stress. The cracks widened, and in a catastrophic moment, Rana Plaza collapsed like a sandcastle hit by a wave. The floors pancaked one by one, not just a collapse, but a complete failure of humanity and responsibility. The sound of the collapse echoed throughout Dhaka, and soon rescue workers rushed to the scene, trying desperately to save days later, but it was too late for many. The horror of the collapse reverberated not just in Bangladesh, but across the world, as people questioned how something like this could happen in the 21st century. And as for Sohail Rana, the greedy man behind this big mess, let's just say he did what most cowards do when they realize they've messed up royally. He fled. He made a beeline for the border, hoping to escape the consequences of his greed. But there's no running from the truth forever, because 4 days later, Sohail Rana was arrested by police near the India-Bangladesh border. And this image of him being hauled away became a symbol of the disaster's aftermath. The balloon disaster. Picture this. It's 1986, and the United Way of Greater Cleveland, a charitable fundraising organization, has just come up with what they think is the ultimate idea for raising awareness. Forget bake sales, car washes, or running marathons. No, these folks decided that they would break a world record by releasing a mind-boggling 2 million helium-filled balloons into the sky. Because, nothing says charity like a city covered in latex bubbles floating away into the great blue yonder. Sounds whimsical, right? What could possibly go wrong with launching millions of balloons all at once? Well, a lot went wrong. On that fateful day in Cleveland, as the air was filled with excitement, and quite literally with helium, thousands of volunteers gathered at a building downtown, tirelessly inflating balloons as though they were creating the world's largest floating art project. Now, here's where things get a little science-y. You see, when you blow up a balloon with your own breath, the gas inside is CO2. Heavy, boring, and definitely not good for flying high. But if you use helium, the balloons are light and buoyant, capable of soaring into the sky like rainbow-colored clouds. The organizers stretched a giant net over a large area, creating a balloon prison of sorts, where 1.4 million balloons gathered, waiting to be unleashed into the world. Yes, they aimed for 2 million, but 1.4 million is still more than enough to make a statement. After all, this was going to set a record for the most balloons released at once. Well, as the clock struck the moment of release, the net was dropped, and the balloons surged upward in a kaleidoscope of colors. Below, 100,000 onlookers cheered in awe, watching the sky fill with what looked like the most magical escape of candy-colored orbs. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, until it wasn't. Now, here's the thing about the weather. It doesn't care about your plans. The forecast that day called for rain and cooler temperatures, which created a little problem for our buoyant friends. Instead of gracefully floating away into oblivion, the balloons hit the atmosphere, cooled down, and started descending back to Earth way too early instead of popping to higher altitudes like it was expected to. Well, that was the beginning of the disaster, because that same day, 2 fishermen went missing on the lake, and search and rescue teams were deployed. Sounds like a straightforward mission, right? Wrong. Imagine trying to spot two humans among thousands of brightly colored balloons bobbing on the lake's surface like some twisted aquatic ball pit. The balloons made the search nearly impossible, and unfortunately, the fishermen were later found deceased. Tragic, yes, but the balloons certainly didn't help the situation. As if that wasn't enough tragedy, the situation became really bad at the airport because the balloons descended into the runway, causing flights to be delayed and planes to be grounded. Then the roads, too, were completely blocked and caused so much traffic and accidents. It's like a scene from a bizarre dream where you're late to work and the only thing in your way is 1.4 million balloons. And let's not forget the horse farm. As if horses weren't already easily spooked by, well, everything. Thousands of balloons floating down from the sky turned into a full-blown horsey horror show. The poor animals panicked, running around like they'd seen their worst nightmare, a sky full of strange floating invaders. Of course, someone had to clean up this mess. Latex balloons don't just disappear, they stick around like glitter after a crafting session. So, United Way had to fork out a fortune to cover the damages. They paid for the environmental cleanup because, surprise, 1.4 million balloons aren't exactly eco-friendly, compensated the horse owners, and dealt with lawsuits from the airport and other affected parties. Ultimately, this colorful, feel-good fundraising stunt turned into a PR disaster, and the event, meant to bring joy and raise awareness, ended up causing chaos, confusion, and significant financial and environmental damage. The Rwanda Disaster. So, Rwanda, a beautiful small country in Central Africa with rolling hills and a lush landscape, has a tragic history of division, power struggles, and one of the most horrific events in human history, the Rwandan genocide of 1994. But to understand the depth of this disaster, let's take a step back in time and see how Rwanda, with its two primary ethnic groups, the Hutu, 84% of the population, and the Tutsi, 15%, became the stage for a genocide that would shock the world. The thing is, Rwanda wasn't always divided along ethnic lines, but after the European colonial powers arrived in 1917, they took control and started enforcing ethnic distinctions. They even issued identity cards to identify every Rwandan as either Hutu or Tutsi, and they made matters worse by showing special favors to only the Tutsi tribe. This obviously made the Hutu feel sidelined, planting the seeds of resentment that would later grow into full-blown violence. By the late 1950s, the Hutu majority had enough of playing second fiddle, so in 1959, tensions boiled over into a conflict known as the Rwandan Revolution, in which the Hutu rose up against the Tutsi and seized power. The Hutu, who had the advantage of numbers, won. Eventually, a Hutu named Juvenal Habyarimana became the president of Rwanda in 1973, and things seemed to settle down for a while anyway. But in the early 1990s, those tensions reignited, and the two tribes started fighting again, which led to the Rwandan Civil War. Although the president kept trying to broker peace, a radical Hutu movement called Hutu Power began spreading hate-filled propaganda against the Tutsi, creating an atmosphere ripe for violence. Well, everything reached a boiling point on April 6, 1994, when the president was assassinated. These sent shockwaves across the country, and Hutu Power extremists were quick to blame the Tutsi for his death, even though they had no proof. They immediately mobilized militants and began spreading vicious propaganda, calling on all Hutu to rise up and kill the Tutsi. It was like pouring gasoline on an already burning fire. Hutu civilians were encouraged, no, ordered, to slaughter their Tutsi neighbors with whom they had lived side by side for years. Soldiers went door to door, breaking into homes, dragging out Tutsi men, women, and children, and killing them in cold blood. There was no escape. The level of violence was unimaginable. Victims were often hacked to death with machetes, beaten, or shot. The genocide lasted for 100 days from April to July 1994, and during that time, between 500,000 and 1 million Tutsi were brutally murdered. This wasn't just a civil war, this was a genocide, an attempt to wipe out an entire ethnic group. The Molasses Flood. So it was just another chilly January day in Boston, 1919, and the people were probably just chilling around drinking hot tea and bundled up against the cold when they suddenly heard a loud explosion that sounded like an earthquake, a bomb, and all of the world all at once. Apparently what just happened was molasses burst. Yes, you heard that right. Molasses, that thick, sticky syrup stuff you might drizzle on pancakes. Only this time it wasn't a drizzle, it was an avalanche of goo, moving fast, and it was not about to be outdone by your breakfast table. You see, at this time, the United States was producing a ton of ethanol, a type of alcohol used in everything from fuel to liquor. To make ethanol, they needed one key ingredient: molasses, that thick, dark syrup we all know and love. Now, ethanol production was booming, so they needed a place to store all this molasses, so they got a giant molasses tank, a beast of a container standing 15 meters tall, about 50 feet, and 27 meters wide, which is almost 90 feet. It looked like someone had dropped a massive soup can in the middle of Boston. The tank was filled to the brim with molasses, which just so happens to be a very temperamental liquid when it comes to temperature. Well, that fateful day, the temperature in Boston suddenly spiked up to around 4 degrees Celsius, 39 Fahrenheit. Now, if you're a person, you might just put on a lighter jacket and carry on, but if you're a giant tank full of molasses, well, you've got problems. On top of the sudden temperature change, they had to pour in a fresh batch of hot molasses. It's like throwing a Mentos into a bottle of soda, except instead of fizz, you get a giant sticky explosion. The molasses inside the tank started to heat up and expand, and expand, and expand some more. And, well, the tank wasn't exactly built like Fort Knox. The steel was thin. The engineers hadn't exactly been thorough in their inspections. As expected, the tank literally burst open like a soda can that had been shaken too much, and out came 12,000 tons of molasses, moving at a terrifying speed of about 56 kilometers per hour, 35 miles per hour. The molasses wasn't just strolling down the street, it was galloping through it. Buildings, streets, and even railroad tracks were no match for the tidal wave of sweetness. Entire sections of the railroad were ripped apart as if the molasses were on a mission to take over the city. People tried to run, but you can't outrun molasses that's charging at you like it's late for an important meeting. Tragically, 21 people died and around 150 others were injured, many of them from asphyxiation, basically getting stuck in the goo and unable to breathe. Others were hit by debris or knocked over as the wave bulldozed its way through the city. It's a terrible way to go, like getting trapped in a massive jar of caramel sauce without any way out. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Just imagine going to your job in New York City, 1911, at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, not knowing that your day is going to take a turn for the absolute worst horror movie ever. At this factory, thousands of women were busy sewing, ironing, and assembling garments. It was just another workday in what seemed like a never-ending cycle of stitching fabric into shirts. But as they labored away on the 8th and 9th floors of the factory, none of these women knew that it was not fabric they'd be trying to escape from, but a deadly fire. Basically, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was perched in a building known for its fire escapes, but only the top 2 floors were used for the garment business, while the other floors housed different businesses. However, the owners of the factory had a bit of a trust issue with their workers because some of them were using the fire escapes to sneak out early or avoid work altogether. So to keep their workforce from escaping, the owners decided that the best solution was to lock the exits. Yep, they locked the very doors that were supposed to be an emergency exit. Brilliant, right? Fast forward to March 25th, 1911. As the workers toiled away inside, someone outside noticed smoke coming from the upper floors, and it wasn't long before the flames started consuming the inside of the factory, where piles of fabric, wooden bins, and other flammable materials were just waiting for the slightest spark to ignite. As the fire roared, panic erupted. Workers scrambled to find exits, but surprise, those Those so-called fire escapes were locked tighter than a jar of pickles your grandma insists you can open yourself. With no access to the fire escapes, the workers were left with only a couple of ways out. But with hundreds of people crammed into the factory, these exits became choke points. People shoved, pushed, and struggled to make their way to safety, but the crowding was unbearable. Some even tried to cram into the building's single elevator, but it quickly became overwhelmed by the mass of people. Many workers, desperate for air, made their way to the windows, but at this point, some faced an unthinkable choice: burn alive or jump. Faced with such an impossible decision, many women leapt from the 8th and 9th floors, hoping for a miracle that would save them from the deadly flames. As the fire raged, fire trucks arrived, but their ladders couldn't even reach the 8th floor. The hoses sprayed water, but it was too late. The fire had consumed everything, and in the end, 146 people died, most of them women. Some died from the flames, others from smoke inhalation, and still others from falling or jumping to their deaths. The Bhopal Disaster. The year is 1984, and the city of Bhopal, India is quiet as its residents sleep peacefully in their homes. But as midnight approaches, an unfamiliar, sharp smell starts to creep through the streets, filling the air. People wake up coughing, their eyes burning, their throats tightening. Some think it's a house fire, but as they rush outside to investigate, there are no flames, only a suffocating cloud of gas hanging over the city. By morning, what began as a night of confusion and fear turned into one of the deadliest industrial disasters in history. To understand the disaster, you need to know first about the factory at the heart of it all. Union Carbide India Limited, UCIL, a subsidiary of the American company Union Carbide Corporation that was established in 1969. UCIL was responsible for producing pesticides to help India's agricultural industry. In the process of making these pesticides, the factory used some of the most toxic chemicals known to man: methyl isocyanate, or MIC for short. MIC is a highly volatile and toxic gas that makes pesticides effective against pests, but is incredibly dangerous to humans. Think of it as the bad guy in this story, except it doesn't wear a black cape. It comes in invisible, lethal clouds. The factory had MIC stored in large tanks, and safety precautions were supposed to be in place. Workers wore gas masks because even small amounts of MIC exposure could be deadly. But over time, the safety measures at the plant began to fail. The equipment was old, maintenance was poor, and safety protocols were, quite frankly, ignored. Sadly, on the night of December 3rd, 1984, water accidentally leaked into the tank containing MIC, triggering a chemical reaction that made the gas unstable. At this point, the factory's safety systems should have kicked in. There were alarms, scrubbers, and flare towers that could neutralize the gas if something went wrong. But, surprise, none of these systems worked properly. The safety valve, which was supposed to contain the pressure, failed, and in a chilling turn of events, the tank ruptured, releasing 30 tons of toxic MIC gas into the atmosphere. At around 1 a.m., the cloud of MIC gas, now free and deadly, drifted into the residential areas surrounding the factory. The gas spread rapidly, carried by the wind, and descended upon the sleeping city like a nightmare come to life. Residents woke up choking, gasping for air, their eyes burning as the gas irritated their lungs, throat, and eyes. Some tried to run, but the air outside was no better. It was a toxic cloud of death. In the panic, many people collapsed right where they stood, overwhelmed by the gas. By morning, thousands of people lay dead in the streets, outside their homes, or in the very beds they had tried to escape from. The initial death toll from the Bhopal disaster was 4,000 people in just one night, but the real impact went far beyond that. Over the next few days, weeks, and months, people continued to suffer from long-term health effects caused by exposure to the gas. When the full scale of the disaster was assessed, the death toll rose to a staggering 20,000 people, making it one of the deadliest industrial accidents in history.